Gathering ingredients for spells is key to your success as a wizard, and now that the weather is changing, I can gather up all sorts of items. Some say the dandelion is a main component to, natural enhancement. Not saying that I need that or anything. Oh no, I've said too much.
Hello folks, and welcome to Dice Chatter. My name is Donnie, and today I will show you how I made this destroyed wagon that you can use in your tabletop games. I feel like a wagon is a great terrain piece to place on the road for your adventurers to discover, or maybe the objective for your wargame is to capture the treasure that has been found in this rundown wagon. Maybe some video foreshadowing? Anyways, I don't want to hold you folks up. Let's jump into things and get started. For our wagon today, we will be making all of the wood sections out of insulation foam. Every board except the axle support will be 5mm by 3mm in size, while the entire cart itself will be 75mm by 50mm. For those wondering, I find metric a lot easier to deal with when crafting, which is why you see me use this measuring system. Anywho, away I go at milling up a number of tiny boards and get them ready for some detail work. Now, just like for my ruined barn video, a tutorial will pop up in the corner, I wanted to create a slightly exaggerated wood grain details. To do this, I use a hot wire foam cutter and run the edge of it along the boards. But I also found that my wooden foam boards here are very small, so I had some difficulty getting in lots of detail. So I also tried out another technique on top of this, using the good old wire brush. Now, mine is a little bit oversized for this terrain build, but I took my time and I was careful to not rip anything apart. And it got the job done. I made and detailed a bunch of foam boards and got ready to start assembling the wagon base. The bed of the wagon was pretty easy to put together. I went once again with some trusty tacky glue for almost the entire foam gluing process. The reason I don't use hot glue for a majority of the build is the fact that everything is so small. On a larger building or something that has larger details, I can get away with a quick glue fix. But with these tiny thin boards, I need time to adjust and move pieces in place to get a perfect fit. Tacky glue will take an hour or so to dry, and once that is complete, I get out the X-Acto blade and start cutting things to shape. Also, make sure to keep the extra pieces around because you never know what you'll need for a future project. Or maybe even this project. For the sides of the bed, I take some of that already set and sealed foam boards and break them off to be about 3 boards high and start gluing, cutting, and build up the walls of the wagon. This little box will be the foundation of our creation, and this will allow us to expand and give more details to the terrain build. Now, as you can see here, I have added a few extra details to the wagon as well. We have a lovely bench for the driver to sit and some side posts that will be good markers for a step later in this build. Also, adding extra details like this will give our build depth and will start making our foam construction look like an actual wagon. I also take a 1cm by 1cm foam post and span it across the bottom of the wagon. This will be our support piece when we start making an axle for the terrain piece. Now, for the axle, we will not be using foam but some 3mm aluminum wire. I thought making circular tiny foam rods would be extremely difficult, so I went with this thin wire. I cut this wire to size and began to melt the foam where I was going to place the axle. I just used my hot wire foam cutter once again and make sure everything fits nicely in place. Then I just used some hot glue and center the rods in place. I will say this was a little difficult, and I'd suggest trying to tackle one wire at a time than doing both. You should get a better position than I did. The wheels are next, and I went ahead and kept to my same foam wooden board technique that I've been using for everything in this build. I bring out my compass, make some circles, and cut everything out. Now, I will say while I'm working on this and gluing things together, this is probably not the best way to get a perfect circle, but knowing that I was going to make a more damaged cover wagon, perfection was technically not needed. I would suggest for those of you who take the non-damaged wagon route to maybe use a circle jig set up on your Proxxon table to achieve perfection. Now, before I adhere the wheels to the wagon, I wanted to make the supports for our cover over the wagon, and I used some thin 1mm aluminum wire to achieve this. I cut 4 strips at about 15mm each and poked them into the foam. I will say this part was very difficult as well, and I was a little nervous if the wire would stay in place and hold its shape. I did use a little bit of tacky glue to hold the wire in the foam, which I did not capture on camera, and I gave this time to dry. Also down the line, once we get to throwing the cover over the wagon, it will give more stability to the build. After this, I decided to go to the Mod Podge step. Now, if I knew how to build terrain pieces, I would have also attached some broken down wagon wheels to the cart at this point as well, but I'm not a smart man, but I do know what love is. Instead, I coat everything in Mod Podge to give it a nice seal. I'm sure you have all seen this done before, so no need for me to dilly-dally here at this step. For the wheels, I had a long debate about what I wanted to do with them and decided to do, well, just something pretty simple. I made a couple breaks and bends to the right side of the wagon's wheels and placed them so that they laid flat on the table surface. Since I'm not using a base for this specific terrain piece, I wanted some more surface area of this build so it stays nice and flat on the tabletop. And once this is all glued together, we can now start painting. For myself, I have a pretty basic airbrush that I use for pretty much all my terrain pieces like this, but going your standard brush method will get you similar results as well. I just like using the airbrush because it's quick and simple and it is an awesome tool. Anywho, I prime everything black to start, getting underneath the wagon and deep into those hidden recesses. After this, I do a series of zenithal highlights going from a lighter gray to an eventual white. Now, if you could try this with an ink, but I just went ahead and used a white primer to achieve this look. I want the wagon to be very bright so that when I come through with other colors, they pop really well over the bright undershading. Now for the base color, I went with an orangey brown. And with that extreme zenithal of white, it really makes that brown stand out. So much that I actually wanted to tone it down just a bit, and also give more definition to the recessed wood grain on the wooden panels. To do this, I went in with some homemade brown and black washes. I pretty much doused the entire wagon with the brown wash, and then selected spots here and there with the black wash that I wanted to darken up. Nothing too crazy or difficult with this step, just give everything some time to dry before we move over to highlighting the raised edges. To brighten everything back up, I did some dry brushing with some lighter tans, light browns, and even some light grays. I tried my best to go over the raised sections and not slap the paint on and do a decent job making light transitions up to the lighter colors. Some spots I went a little overboard, but we do fix this in our next step. This is where I add a little bit more wash over some select spots to show some grunginess to the wagon. Maybe some of these wood panels are rotting and moisture has seeped in. I take a brown and green wash and try to achieve this idea. Once again, I take my time and let everything dry before we tackle the final process of the build, the cover over the wagon. For the cover, I use two main ingredients, thinned down glue and some tissue paper. As you see, I just laid it right over the painted up wagon and started brushing on this watered down glue mixture. I will say that this step is a little tricky and that the tissue is extremely easy to tear, so don't get discouraged if after a few tries it doesn't seem to work to get in that perfect position. Now you can always tear it off, or in some cases just lay another tissue right over top and continue the process. It is also important to note that if you let this dry and then attempt to apply washes to the cover, it will rehydrate again and possibly start tearing. So once I got everything in place, I just went ahead and started to add a series of washes over the tissue and add in the old-timey, been around a long while feel. I added some browns, greens, and even a little bit of skin color to add variety in the deterioration of the cloth. Oh, and one final step before we call this wagon done. I wanted to add a little bit of blood splatter to the side, so I grabbed my Blood for the Blood God, a toothbrush, and gave a good flick to the cover of the wagon. And once that is complete, we can hop over to some glamour shots. So there you have it, folks, my take on a destroyed covered wagon. I think the best part about going through this build is the fact that if you don't snap the wheels and make the cover, well, look a little bit more neat and tidy, you could also make yourself a wagon that, well, is not destroyed. I also look forward to using this guy in some upcoming games where you could hide some enemies or found treasure inside the bed of the wagon. Since you have made it this far in the video, feel free to subscribe, check out the Patreon, and do all of the other socials. Until next time, folks, I want to thank you all for watching, and of course, happy gaming.